Let's turn to Chuck Todd. Hey, Chuck, good morning.
Good morning. You know, only in Trump's Washington is the shutdown not the lead story. I had to just think about that for a minute. Anyway, sorry, guys.
We're going to get to that in just a second. But you see all these people departing: Secretary Mattis, Chief of Staff John Kelly, Secretary Tillerson. Help put this in perspective, all right? On the crazy scale, how crazy is this?
You know, Hoda, it's a shame that there's been this sense, and I think some people that watch, I'm sure the Today Show think sometimes you say it's a crisis, It's a shame people might be so numb to this, and some of us are so numb. I can't underscore how serious things are right now. I can't underscore the break between Senate Republicans and this president. I mean, just think about this fact. About Secretary Mattis and the president's decision to pull out of Syria. Vladimir Putin cheered him, and the president's Secretary of Defense resigned. That's sort of the stark reality, and you could just see that the Republicans in Washington in particular, I think, feel as if they've been smacked in the face, the hot water drop, whatever metaphor you want to pick. That's the feeling they have right now.
Chuck, Secretary Mattis, as you know, was #1 on the list of people around the president who were believed to put some guardrails in place, who could perhaps be buffers to some of his impulses. Now just about all of those people are gone. What does that mean for the future of this White House as we turn the corner into 2019?
Well, look, I think the president believes he knows what he's doing now. I think the president believes he doesn't need the approval of these other folks, that he knows better, and if anything, he's better off fighting. So I think what it means is there aren't going to be other people, and I think those that are left in this West Wing, those that are left in this administration, if you've made the decision to stay, you've made the decision to essentially fall in line. So I think that means this idea that there are, quote, people that are the guardrails, that idea is no longer operational.
Meanwhile, Chuck, the clock is ticking to a potential shutdown tonight at midnight. Do you think the government will be open come midnight tonight? And if so, does President Trump get the wall or some version of the wall?
Right now, it doesn't look like it is. I think that on December 21st, everybody feels as if they can dig in their heels. Let's see what happens on Monday morning when it's December 24th and the reality that these folks realize that they're not going to be where they promised they would be. The president is tired of this crummy weather. He may be fine not going to Mar-a-Lago tonight. I'll be curious where he is in 48 hours.
All right, Chuck. Of course, you're going to have a lot more on Meet the Press on Sunday. We appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Chuck.
Bye.